Quick warning, the subject matter of these stories may be considered sensitive by some viewers, and viewer discretion is advised. Also, if you have a story you want to send my way, please go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to submit it. And of course, thank you. So, I have a very personal story about my ex-boyfriend from way back when I was a 16-year-old girl. Back then, as most kids do, I thought I was invincible, and like no one could tell me what to do or run my life. I had it in my head that anyone that tried to give me advice or told me that I should do anything was trying to control me, and I was unwilling to listen to them. Basically, I was your stereotypical teenage girl that was in love with the first guy that had paid any attention to her. The problem was that he, in and of himself, was a problem. He was 20 and had a car and was into a few substances. I never dove down that rabbit hole with him, but I was there when he would use, so I saw what it did to him, how he would get, and so on. I'm pretty sure it goes without saying that my parents did not like me being with a 20-year-old guy that was a user and was probably on a list down at the local police station of people to watch. That, plus the fact that, again, I was 16 at the time this all took place, yeah, they really didn't like me being with him. Unfortunately, my parents were pushovers. They never found that balance of being assertive and being relaxed. They would tell me that I wasn't allowed to see him, and I would just roll my eyes and laugh. Then, I would say I was going over to my friend Lisa's house, and would just meet him at the corner of the street. They knew, they just never stopped me, which is ultimately what caused this whole thing to play out. For my ex, we're going to go with the name Jason. Obviously, that's not his name, but it works. Jason was one of those guys that literally gave zero cares, and that's probably where I developed that mentality. If it helps to explain the dynamic between he and I, we met at school. Now, I know what you may be thinking. You were 16, he was 20, so it could have been you were a freshman and he was a senior type of situation if the two of you were together for 2 years prior to the event. But nope. That would actually almost have been a better situation than what it was. Jason was actually hired as a janitor at my school during my sophomore year. So, when we met, he was an adult in authority at my school, and I was a clueless 16-year-old girl. And as all wonderful romances go, we actually first spoke during lunchtime when I went to throw my trash away, and he was cleaning up a mess on the floor by the garbage cans. Looking back, the fact that he talked to me and hit on me back when I was a student raises a lot of red flags. But at the time, I was just happy to be getting positive attention. Because as non-controlling as my parents were, they were also just simply not present in most of my life. So now that you know who Jason is, and the fact that he was obviously a predator, I think it's best to get into the events that took place. At this point, we had been together for a few months, probably close to 4 or 5, and the school year was getting close to being over. At this point, I hadn't had a whole lot of time to spend with Jason, as I'd been cramming for my finals, because deep down, I was still that nerdy girl that wanted to get good grades, and despite the fact that my grades had been kind of slipping, I was not going to fail my 10th grade year. Because I was studying, I wasn't seeing Jason as much as he had liked, which he made obvious every time he saw me in school. He would pull me away into an empty section of the hallway to make out with me and grope me. By this point, we hadn't consummated our relationship completely, and he'd been pretty good about keeping his hands off of me while we were in the school building. But around this time, he started to not seem to care as much. It was like the less he saw me, the more hands-on he would get when he did see me. Unfortunately for him, this was the early 90s, and our school did have cameras. And I think you can see where this is kind of going. He ended up getting fired, and the school threatened that they were going to have to give the footage to the police as I was a minor. Now, you may think that this is where the story ends, but no, it's not. And this was more the cause of what actually happened. On the day that Jason got fired, he drove back up to the school near the end of the day and waited for me out front. As I walked out to get on the bus, he shouted out to me and waved for me to come over. I was a bit confused as he usually got off the shift after I got home, but it was a nice surprise, so I hopped into his van and we drove away. Now, at first, I thought we were just going to do the normal things that we did when we were together, but something seemed a bit different this time around. He looked agitated and almost scared. I tried to ask him about what was wrong, and he shushed me, which was really strange to me. I let it go for a little while, but I then quickly realized that we weren't heading in the direction of anything that I knew, so I asked him again what was going on. He pulled over into the parking lot of a store, and just kind of sat there for a moment, staring out into the empty space. I wasn't sure what to do, so I sat there in silence for a little while with him, and just accepted that something was going on, and that he would tell me what it was eventually. After a bit of this, he asked me if I loved him, which was a strange thing to ask, especially sitting in a Kmart parking lot. Now, at this point, there hadn't been an exchange of I love yous between us. I was still shy about things, and while there had been some intimacy that happened, it never went all the way, and we never talked about love. However, I was a child, with a child brain, and that's the honest truth. He was in a position of power over me because he was an adult, and he had the authority. And I thought that what we had was, in fact, love. Being the dumb little girl that I was, I told him that I did love him. He then asked if I wanted to be with him, and again, I told him that I wanted to be with him more than anything else. He nodded, while it looked like he was starting to cry. He then told me that he had been fired from the school because they saw us kissing on the cameras. I thought that this was the whole problem, that he'd been fired and that it was my fault. I know now it wasn't my fault, but back then I blamed myself. So I thought that he was going to break up with me or something, and I told him I was so sorry that it happened, and then mentioned that it was because of me and that I would try to tell the school that I should be the one punished and not him. He then says that he didn't care about the job. He cared about losing me, and that not being at the school meant that he would never see me again. He threw in a few flattering adjectives there to, I guess, really lighten the mood, and then looked me straight in the eyes and told me that he loved me and wanted to be with me forever. At this point, I was bawling and telling him that I was sorry, that I wanted to be with him too, which he took as the go-ahead for his plan. His plan was to drive off into the sunset with me in the passenger seat and, I guess, live with me forever in his minivan. I really don't know what he was thinking long term, or if he was at all at that moment, but he looked at me and said, "They're not going to take you away from me. You're mine." I kind of just nodded and said okay, unsure of what exactly that meant, but he put the car in drive and took off from the parking lot toward the highway. Now, at first, the adrenaline and excitement of running away from the city that I had always known, and from my life, was great. I was excited to get out onto the road and be free from whatever burdens there were of being a suburban 16-year-old girl, whatever that means. We drove until around 1 or 1:30 in the morning, just going straight out until he felt like he couldn't drive anymore. I didn't have my license, so our only option was to pull off somewhere and sleep. My thought was, of course, a hotel or a motel. His plan was for us to sleep in the cluttered area in the back of the van. So, we crawled back there and I told him goodnight, which was not part of his plan. I'm not going to get into the entire detail of everything that happened here, because I don't want to relive a lot of it, and some readers may have dealt with similar trauma. I'm just going to say that he wanted it, I told him no and that I wasn't personally ready for it, and then it happened anyway. This was the first point where he was ever physically violent or aggressive with me. Prior to this, minus the groping and the few other sexual things that had happened between us, he had never been aggressive. This was to the point that he hurt me. And that's where I'm going to leave that. The next morning was obviously awkward. I felt like he had violated my trust and violated me, but I also felt like maybe that was a normal feeling. Mostly because I had no idea what normal was in this circumstance. It was weird, because he wouldn't look at me when we woke up, and he barely even spoke to me when we got on the road. It was like he knew what had happened was wrong, but instead of facing it, he had to shut me out. We got back on the highway and started to head west, which I guess was his plan. But while we drove, he just kept staring forward and not speaking, not looking at me, not even acknowledging me. Every time I would say something, he would give a short answer or just ignore me. Again, I felt like I had done something wrong here. Like I had done something to make him mad, and I was so very confused about the whole situation. Then I said something that I guess I shouldn't have. I asked him when we were going to go back home. I don't know why I asked this. I don't know what made me think we would ever be going back home, like this wasn't seriously a kidnapping, but I just straight up asked him, when are we going to go back? As soon as I asked this, he launched into a tirade about how much of an ungrateful bitch I was. How I obviously didn't love him, and how he was disgusted with the fact that he had given himself to me, only for me to be so ungrateful. This went on for quite a while. I just started crying and staring out at the road while he screamed at me and berated me. I think it was at this point that I realized I may have made a mistake. Better late than never, right? We drove for a while longer, until he pulled off the highway and parked at a gas pump, and then said that he needed to fill the tank up. He handed me a $20 bill and told me to go pay the man inside. At this point, I think I was a literal mess. Having not showered, slept in a hot van all night, been on the road for almost 24 hours and sobbing endlessly, but I told him okay, and I walked into the gas station to give the clerk the money. As soon as I got in, and I went to hand him the cash, I glanced over to get the pump number, and I watched as Jason started the van and drove off. I just stood there and watched this man that had taken me from my home and taken what was left of my innocence abandon me in an off-the-highway gas station. I had no idea where I was. I had no money other than the $20. And this was the early 90s, so I didn't have a cell phone. All I had was my small shoulder bag, and I carried it more for aesthetic than utility. Standing there, watching him drive away, and then looking at the clerk who was just staring at me confused, I think that was the most surreal moment of my life. I just kind of blinked and opened my mouth to talk, and then puked what little I'd eaten for the past day on the floor of his store. He told his coworker to call 911 for me, and ran over to stop me from falling onto the ground and just kept telling me that I was going to be okay. The ambulance showed up, as well as the police, and they took me to a nearby hospital for checkup. Around this time was actually when I learned where I was. He had abandoned me at a gas station about an hour away from Colorado Springs. And to tell you how far that was, we lived close to central Illinois. He had driven me across our home state, through part of Missouri, most of Kansas, and then into Colorado, and just left me there after violating me. After I got to the hospital and was given fluids and food to get me stable, the police started asking questions. And that's when I let the floodgates open. I told them everything. I told them about Jason, who he was, what we were. I told them about what he had done the night before, everything up to the point that he left me at the gas station. I dug my home phone number out of my purse and asked them to please call my parents. They took it, and they told me to try to relax while they took the situation from there. And let me tell you, I absolutely did. I think I passed out as soon as they left the room. The next thing I remember was being woken up and told that my parents had been contacted and that they were on their way to come and get me. Obviously, I had a lot of explaining to do to my parents about everything. I told them about what had happened, and I apologized nonstop for putting them through this. I know I probably scared them to death when I didn't come home that night, and I can imagine they were terrified when they got a call from a Colorado police department saying they were calling about their daughter. The police did eventually catch Jason. He was heading to California, and after they learned about it, they put out a call to look for his car. They pulled him over, and they arrested him from there. Thankfully, me being a minor, and the cameras at the station catching him pulling up and me getting out of the car, alongside the footage of what had happened at the school, was enough to put him away for a very long time on a number of charges. Those charges include kidnapping, of course. I had to testify against him and explain how he had manipulated me, but after that, I never saw him again. Now, I won't say it was easy getting past this whole thing. Thankfully, I wasn't pregnant after that night, which was a real fear of mine. I did have to go to a therapist for a while to really work through it, though, and eventually, I was able to say that it was not my fault, that he had coerced me, and that I was a child being led by an adult in this situation. This was around 30 years ago at this point, and while it still does bring back those uncomfortable feelings, it's more important for me to look forward and remember that I am a stronger person now. I have a life that I'm happy with, and he'll be rotting in prison until he's at least in his 60s. This story involved me, but my mother was the true target. Back when I was about 13 or so, my parents moved from Ohio to Kentucky. Apparently, they were both born and raised there, but had moved to Ohio at some point and were now moving back. I'd only been there a few times when we went to visit family, so it was definitely going to be a new experience for me. I seemed to do alright. Being an outgoing younger girl, I was quick to make friends. My parents met up with old friends and introduced me and their kids as well, so it worked out. I became pretty good friends with one of them, and even babysat a few of them as well. A little under a year into us moving back, our neighbors across the street moved out. And after seeing a couple going in and out and some renovations being done, a new family moved in. Before my parents could go over and introduce themselves, though, someone was knocking on our door. I answered it to see an older guy, probably close to my parents' age. He looked very nice and super tall. I remember he leaned down and smiled at me and said, "Huh, you must be Carla's kid." I knew that that was my mom's name, and I didn't get any weird vibes from him, so I confirmed and asked if he was looking for her, to which he nodded. So I shouted for my mom and invited him in. He walked in, but stayed right in the mudroom area. When my mom came into the room, she smiled and looked surprised. The guy smiled and greeted her, and she went up and hugged him. And that's when she introduced him as Jim, and told me that she had went to school with him, and they started talking a bit. She explained that she had moved out of state, and that they had recently moved back here, and he looked surprised and teased her about why would she be moving back, and she mentioned being homesick and her father-in-law, my grandfather, not doing very well. He again seemed shocked about her response, and then she started calling for my dad. He came in, and they shook hands, but I remembered at that point he looked worried about something. I remembered this because my dad was also a big guy, and people often seemed scared of him. So I kind of figured that that's what it was. He actually built houses for a living, so he was always super tall and a heavier build. He typically had a long beard and was bald, so he could definitely look intimidating, but he truly was a gentle giant. He was like your stereotypical biker, but he also hated bikes. He's hilarious. Anyways, they didn't talk very long after that. He mentioned next time he would come over to introduce his wife, and then left. There was nothing too strange about this interaction. A few days later, though, I came home from a friend's house and saw my mom, Jim, and a lady that I would learn was his wife sitting in our living room and talking. I was introduced to Tammy, his wife, but I noticed that she did not seem as nice as Jim was. My mom asked how school was and how my friend was, and I started talking about something I made or did in school. My mom congratulated me, and Jim became really excited about it. He said something like, "Oh, that's incredible. You're a really smart kid. You must be so proud of her." My parents told me when I did a great job, so I wasn't ignored or neglected. But the way that he was so ecstatic about it, it made me pretty happy too. And that's when he touched Tammy's stomach and said he hoped his kid was as smart as I was. Being a kid, I just made an offhand comment that I would help with babysitting if they ever needed one. Jim was smiling and about to say something when Tammy made a comment about being a stay-at-home, and it wouldn't be necessary. Her reactions they seemed really weird. Like it made me feel like I had said something wrong. Jim said something about it being their first kid, and my mom just told me to go do my homework. From then on, I seemed to see a lot of Jim. When I was out riding my bike, I would see him and he would wave me over and ask me about my day, ask me what kind of activities I was into, just things like that. He would then ask me about my mom, what she was doing, what she was making for dinner, and even what she liked to do in her spare time. I didn't think it was that weird at first since they were friends, and I would just answer the best I could. Then, he would make comments about how pretty I was, and how much I looked like her. She had dark hair and dark eyes, whereas my dad had orange/reddish hair, or beard, at least. So I always thought that I looked a lot more like my mom. Again, I thought it seemed normal, and I would ask him if he wanted to talk to my mom or something like that, but then he would always ask me if my dad was around. When I would tell him he was home, he would quickly make a comment about being busy or say no thanks, and then go back to his house. Thinking back, he never seemed to want to be around when my dad was home as well. Slowly, it would get weirder, though. I noticed that he started to change his appearance. He would dress differently, he started gaining weight, growing a beard, and then at one point he even shaved his head. I remember at one time saying at dinner that Jim looked like Dad now, and while my dad laughed, my mom just chuckled but looked a little uncomfortable about it. And that's when things really went downhill. I came home from school one day and he stopped me as I was getting the mail, and he asked me to help him with something in his house. I didn't think anything of it, as he'd given me things before and went in. When I did, he showed me pictures of a little girl and asked if I knew who that was. When I told him that I didn't, he said it was a picture of me as a small child, and I had no reason to not believe him. The girl had dark hair, dark eyes, and she reminded me of myself, and that's whenever he explained. He said that my mom had given him that picture because of a secret she had kept, and that secret was that he was actually my dad. She said that the reason they moved away was because the man that I called my father wanted to run away with my mom, being that he was jealous of Jim, but she wanted him to at least have a photo of me. I didn't believe him at first. How could he be my father? Why would another man take me in as his own, or at least not tell me the truth? And then I remembered what he looked like, having identical features of my mom, and it kind of messed me up. I told him I had to leave, and he told me to promise that I wouldn't tell my fake dad so that we wouldn't get hurt. I promised, went home, and immediately told my mother. I did tell her when it was just her, though, just in case there was any truth to it. To say that she was livid, that would be an understatement. She assured me that my dad was my real dad, and that there was no way he could have been my father, considering they moved out of the state long before I was even thought of, which made sense to me. She then told me to try and avoid him as much as possible, and she made sure to meet me at the driveway for the bus to pick me up and drop me off, so he wouldn't be able to stop me either, worried he may try to do something else. I agreed, and later that night, I heard my parents talking about it because, of course, I was still a nosy kid that loved both of their parents, and I was worried that this may cause them to get a divorce. Don't worry, it didn't. My mom was furious about it, but my dad seemed calmer, saying that if he tried anything, he would be prepared. The first time I got off the bus, my mom was waiting there for me. We started walking back home when we saw Jim walking toward us, smiling. My mom told me not to say anything to him, and as he approached us, he tried asking my mom how she was when she cut him off. She said some pretty mean things to him, including that he was delusional and that he needed help, and that he needed to avoid me at all cost if he wanted to see the birth of his own child. He honestly looked like he was about to cry behind his fake smile. And with that, he didn't say anything else, and he just turned around and went home. However, while we wouldn't see Jim again, we would see Tammy, banging on our door, yelling expletives. I was in the dining room, doing my homework at the table, and I remember jumping because of the banging. My mom answered the door, and she immediately started calling her names and threatening her. I went into the living room to see what was going on, and I remember her calling her a home wrecker, specifically. She then tried to hit my mom with a golf club and got her in the leg, and my mom didn't really want to do anything to her because she was pregnant. She finally got the door closed, and she had me call the cops while she did so. Tammy managed to run back to her house, and the cops showed up at ours, and my mom explained what all had happened. And that's about when my dad got home too. They both decided together not to press charges. My dad's choice, not my mom's though. But they were able to get a protective order, so she wasn't allowed to come over here again. My mom started picking me up from school though, just to be safe, and every once in a while, we would see Jim sitting out on his front porch, but nothing more. After some time, we hardly saw any trace of them, like the cars were never in the driveway. We saw a few people come over and go over that were not Jim or Tammy, and then eventually started seeing less and less activity in the house. And that's when my mom started letting me ride the bus again, and life continued as normal, and I had even forgotten about it until recently. My parents are still together to this day, and they love to tease each other, and after my mom got a discount on her Starbucks one day, and my dad made the comment about there being another crazy ex. And that's when they actually started talking to me about what had happened. Apparently, he was an ex-boyfriend that she had in high school, but he became really weird and clingy, so she broke it off with him. And then he got even weirder. She completely forgot about it after graduating, getting married, moving on, so it never actually crossed her mind. When we moved back, she wasn't really worried about it since they were all adults and knowing he was married with a kid on the way. Apparently that wasn't the case though. And not only did he try to continue to persuade my mother to leave my dad, he also tried convincing me I was his daughter. And this was all found out by his wife, Tammy, who then became enraged, and that's what caused her to be so off-putting around me and trying to start a fight with my mother, I guess. They then told me that she had moved out, and he followed shortly after, based on information she got from neighbors and friends. So there's that. My mom had a weird ex-boyfriend that tried to convince me that I was his kid, and every other plan that he had failed. So, I hope that he and Tammy are happy with their lives, wherever it is they are now. But also, I hope to never meet either one of them ever again. Back in my early 30s, I started getting that feeling like I was running out of time to find that one person to spend the rest of my life with. It didn't help that many of my close friends were getting married and having kids, so I decided to try dating apps. I definitely had my share of flops, but then I ended up meeting a guy named Leo. He was a great guy at first, too. He was working at a warehouse when we first met, but he had big aspirations to start his own business. He wanted to repair and restore computers and other electronics. He was going to school for business as well, and with his dad owning his own business, he made it seem like he was going to help him out with it as well. So, he seemed to have his work life figured out. He was handsome, funny, smart, so it all seemed to work out for me. We were dating for probably 6 to 8 months, I believe, and since we hadn't had any issues, I suggested he move in with me. I even agreed to clean out my spare room so he could turn it into an office or workshop so that he could start on his business. He got his workshop set up. I helped him with buying some of the equipment that he needed, got him business cards, and we even set up a website for him. I was working as an executive assistant, so I thought if this all worked out, I could help him with it, and we could possibly do this together. However, I started learning that he was the type that wanted or needed instant gratification. He started posting his services, and when he didn't get any responses within the next day or so, he started to get discouraged. I tried to be optimistic, but he would always shoot it down. So finally, after a few days of moping, he got a call for an offer. Someone was needing something done on their computer, so they came by, dropped it off, and off to the office he went to work on it. I tried going in there a little later, but he pretty much ignored me. I tried asking if he wanted something to drink or anything, and he got mad at me saying that I was interrupting him. That was the closest thing I'd had to a fight with him, and I didn't know how to take it, so I just went to bed. He did finally come to bed, and was being really affectionate, so I let it go, thinking it was just the stress of a first customer, maybe. So he turned it in, he did what they needed, and they left a review for him, so he was feeling pretty good about it. However, he wanted to quit his job after just this one job, and he was adamant that everything would work out. Now, I made decent money, but it wasn't going to be enough to cover everything we had going at the time. I was still paying for the rent alone. He offered to, but I told him it was fine as long as he continued to pay for his car, since I had to pay for my own. He was also still in school, but he did have a few months left, so I wanted him to focus more on finishing that first. I also paid for the utilities and groceries, but he did help with the groceries on occasion. For the most part, he used his money for his business. I was worried that we wouldn't make enough right now to afford everything if he quit his job without any backup plan. However, his thought was that it would totally work out, but if it didn't, then he would just go to work for his dad until it did. And with me being a little nervous still, I accepted that. As you may have guessed, this did not work out. At all. I thought since he was so set on this being his career, that he knew what he was doing and had quite a bit of knowledge on electronics and tech stuff. However, that was not the case. I quickly started learning that he knew the pretty basic stuff, like how to run some diagnostics, how to replace hard drives, RAM, and download software, but other than that, he did not know what he was doing. People would bring in their systems, from desktops to laptops, cell phones, and even gaming consoles, and he would be watching videos on YouTube on how to do something, calling his friends to get help, all kinds of things. When I tried suggesting that he list specific things he could do to avoid this, he didn't want to hear it. He kept saying I was putting him down, so I gave up on trying to help or be a part of his deal. I let it go and continued to pay for the things that we needed, thinking it'll turn around and things will be fine, but that would never happen. He ended up completely screwing up someone's computer, and he had to pay for a new one, which meant that I had to help. So, I started making his car payments because business wasn't picking up like he expected, and he was running out of money. This continued on for several months. I tried everything I could to help, but he was not budging on his changes. He also dropped out of school, saying that it wasn't helping him, so he didn't need it anymore. He continued to cause more issues, so he would have to replace things or refund people, so the money was not coming in. Then, he pretty much just gave it all up. I would come home and he would be sitting in the living room, barely dressed, watching TV or something. I would ask if he had any jobs, if he did anything to improve or add to his services, and he would get defensive. I tried for the longest time to do anything that I could to help, but words can only go so far. It doesn't make the pocketbook bigger. So, when it got down to me not being able to afford all of the expenses anymore, I told him he had to get a job, even if it meant with his dad. He did not like this idea at all, and pretty much just refused to do so. I was never really an aggressive person, so I just nagged him about it and explained this to my parents, asking what I should do, and they told me that I should give him an ultimatum. That was one of the hardest things that I had to do because I did still care for him. However, when I told him this, I saw a side of him that I never had before. He threw quite the tantrum. He punched a hole in my wall, kicked and dented my fridge, and knocked over one of my lamps and trashed his workshop, and then left. He was gone for a few days, and then basically said in a long text that we were over since I didn't believe in him or had his back. This hurt me because, again, I didn't want him to leave, but that's what he chose. So, he came back, got his stuff, while me and my dad were there, and he stopped calling or texting me and didn't say one word to me. As mentioned, I was pretty hurt by this, but I did my best to move on and kept myself busy between friends and family and repairing things. Life went on as normal, but then weird things started happening in my condo. I would get home, and I would go to make something for dinner, and realize that I was really low or out of something that I was sure that I had. I, of course, just thought I was mistaken, though, and moved on. But then things started disappearing that I knew I had, like toilet paper that I had just bought, and I would notice the pack was open and used. So I started calling the rental office to ask about maintenance, and if they used any of the tenants' stuff while they were there. And they said they would look into it because they weren't supposed to be, and that was it. However, it then turned into things coming up missing. Like some of my jewelry, or clothing, or other things like that. I was going to put in a complaint, but then came to the conclusion that I noticed the missing items after the maintenance was done, and couldn't confirm if these items were missing when they weren't around. So, I was rather frustrated that this was happening, but I had no proof of any of it. My dad then suggested that I install a camera pointing at my front and back doors to see if anyone came in, and he even helped me to get it set up. As time went on, I would notice more things used, missing, lights left on, but when I would check the cameras, it would say it was offline. Now, I was worried that someone was getting in and that they somehow knew about the cameras and were deactivating them. Feeling unsafe at this point, I went out with a friend from work, Steven, just to not be home. I told him what had been happening, and Steven was a nice kid. He was in his mid-20s, I believe, and he was also a tech and hardware guy at my work. I had even asked him on multiple occasions what to do on certain systems or computers for not only my personal computer, but also when Leo was working on something as well, since he wouldn't involve me in anything, so he knew about him too. He knew that we had split up, and I told him about the concerns with the cameras and everything, so he offered to take a look at said cameras. I thought this was a great idea, as I trusted him with that kind of stuff, and I had him follow me home. We got back to my place. He looked at the cameras and the website and app that I used for it to see what could be the issue. He didn't think it was faulty since it seemed to happen around the same time every day, give or take an hour or so. He thought that someone may have actually been doing it on purpose. This, of course, had me worried as who would want to target me. I didn't exactly have any enemies. Steven then showed me where on the app I could turn the cameras on or off or delete video history, and he asked me if anyone else had access to the camera, and I told him no. No one but him now and my parents even knew about it. He suggested that I change all of my login information just to be safe, and then did a malware scan on my computer. The most terrifying part about all of this was that he actually found a keylogger on my laptop. So he did some things to it and had me change a lot of passwords. I actually learned not to use easy passwords and reuse them due to this. Since it was getting late, I had ordered dinner for us and offered to let him stay the night as well. I grabbed some blankets from the closet in the spare bedroom, and that's when I noticed they seemed to have been strewn all over the place. My first thought was that Leo did this back when he was grabbing all of his stuff, and then went back to give them to Steven. I went to bed in my room, but it couldn't have been very long until I started hearing yelling and things being broken. I ran into my living room to see Steven being held down by Leo. I immediately ran over to them to try and get him to stop when Leo had knocked me down. He must have noticed what he did because he took off. After making sure that Steven was okay, I called the cops. I explained everything that had happened to them. Even though he was practically strangling him, he said he didn't want to press charges, but the cops still did because he technically hit both of us. However, that's when everything started coming together. They asked how we would have gotten in, and I realized that he probably still had a key. So then I started thinking, he was probably coming in, using my stuff, eating my food, and who knows what else. But why was he never on camera? And that's when Steven said he probably saw the cameras and figured out my login credentials. Being that he knew at least some things, he was probably the one that put the keylogger on my laptop too, and was monitoring everything I did. I felt so vulnerable at that time, and was so worried about being watched and spied on. He's the one that chose to leave too, I didn't make him do so. I was thankful that Steven still even wanted to talk with me after all this, but he helped me with nearly wiping my computer, setting up encryption and password stuff, and I even got a new phone, worried that he may have done something to that too. I also realized that under all of those blankets were some of his tools that he was hiding there, so he could work on stuff while I wasn't home. So I also changed the locks as well. Leo did come and get all of his stuff, while I had a cop and Steven there as well. And I never heard from him again. He tried adding me on Facebook too, but every time he did, I blocked him and changed my password again. And that's probably more on the paranoid side, but I don't want this to ever happen again. So be safe out there, people, and don't be so trusting, no matter how desperate you may feel. So this was a true story collection of stories about ex-lovers, exes in general, just ex-people in their lives. All of these stories are definitely interesting, definitely have that creepy aspect to them. If my neighbor tried to convince my kid, both of which I don't really have, that the kid was his, I think I'd be pretty livid. The dad was really calm in that one. I'll commend him for that, because I would have been pissed. The one with the cameras and the guy breaking into the house and keylogging the laptop, he's just that's a psycho, obviously. That guy's crazy. That's terrible. And then the first one with the janitor, I really don't have words for that one. That story is gut-wrenching. And I'm very sorry for the OP that had to go through that, the original person. I wouldn't want anyone to ever have to live through that situation. I wouldn't, no, ever. That's just horrible. So, thank you again to everyone who submits their stories to me or lets me use their stories. It is always appreciated. And without you guys, well, I really wouldn't have a channel, would I? Same goes to all you subscribers, which if you're new and have not subscribed yet, please hit that button. We hit 7,500 subscribers, 500,000 views on this channel, huge milestones, and we're just gonna keep going, I promise. If you want to help those milestones continue to happen, leave me a thumbs up on the video, tell the YouTube algorithm it's a good vid. You can also leave me a comment letting me know your thoughts, or any ideas you have for topics. I am copying those, please do leave them. Try to keep the ideas in the realm of reality. Don't say, like, scary space stories, because I'm not contacting the ISS to ask them for stories. Just saying. Anyways, yeah, if you want to support further, Patreon, channel memberships, 99 cents a month, $1 a month, whatever. You can get early access to my content if you want it. It's up to you. And yeah, nothing more to say other than, again, thank you to everyone out there. I love you all. I hope you're having a beautiful day. And of course, I hope you have a gorgeous weekend. It is cold here. I am cold, but that's not the point. Yeah. I hope you all have a gorgeous weekend. I hope it's either eventful or uneventful, whichever one you decide to happen. And I hope I'll see you in the next video. But of course, until then, my friends, much love and sleep well.